The first product improvement that we would like to share is Business Glossary Phase 1. And I'll do a quick demo, but before that, just a quick intro to Business Glossary itself. It's really a way of representing a tree of concepts that are useful for attaching to existing data sets or fields. So for example, at your company, you may decide to have a taxonomy that says classification as a top level node. And within that, terms like confidential or highly confidential or sensitive that live within the classification node. Similarly, you can have another node called clients and accounts, and all client and account stuff lives under there, like an account. And an account can also contain a balance, which itself might be a term under the clients and accounts node. Now, similarly, you can also have relationships across these taxonomies. For example, a balance or an account might be confidential or might have highly confidential data. And so you can have a relationship between accounts as well as highly confidential terms. So let me show you how you would describe something like this using the most favorite language of data engineers, YAML. And I'll get into a terminal. So this is a PR I opened earlier today. It shows you how you can create a business glossary using YAML and then ingest it as a standard source. So first, let's look at the recipe. If everyone is familiar with the recipe, this is what it looks like. You have a source and a sink. The sink looks exactly the same. Destination is DataHub REST. And the source in this case is of type DataHub Business Glossary. This is a new source that I've created. And a config file, which is the business glossary itself. So let's look at what that business glossary looks like. All right, firstly, we have a version identifier and then a source, which kind of describes who is even specifying this glossary. So in my case, I decided that DataHub is the author of the glossary. In your company's case, you might have your company's name here. And then default owners for all things in the glossary. These could be users, they could also be groups. You can have a URL, for example, this could point to the GitHub location of where this business glossary file is stored. And then below that, you have nodes, and then contained within nodes, you have terms. So let's look at the nodes I created. I created a node called classification, just like I showed you in the slide deck before. It's got a description and it has terms within it, like names. The terms have names like sensitive, confidential, highly confidential, with some descriptions attached to them. Similarly, I created another node called personal information, which contains terms like email, address, gender. And notice for the email term, I also have an inherits specification. And email seems to be inheriting from classification.confidential, which is a term I just described. Inherits is really like a relationship. And so what I'm basically saying is emails are classified as confidential. The owner in this case is a group. And as we go further down, you see gender is inheriting the sensitive classification. Further down, we have another node called clients and accounts. And that includes, I copied this actually from Fibo. And that's why when I define the term, I say that the term source is external, the source ref is Fibo. I even give a link for where this term is defined in the Fibo glossary. And then I have some specializations of the term, like it inherits highly confidential, and it contains another term, which is a client and account balance term, which I define next. The balance term is also another term contained in Fibo, comes from external. So this is what a YAML file looks like. And you could either have all of this glossary in a single file, or you could split it up across multiple files, as long as you preserve the overall structure. And you can imagine checking this into source control and just managing it just like you manage all your code. Now, when this is checked in and you want to ingest this into DataHub, all you need to do is just run DataHub ingest and point it to the recipe file that I just described. So let's ingest this recipe. But before that, let's go into DataHub itself and check whether we have a glossary ahead of time or not. . All right, so we are in the DataHub UI, and this is the home page. Let's look at the business glossary. It's empty. Now let's go back to our terminal and run that ingestion. Hold a deep breath while ingestion runs. There you go. We ingested 11 terms. Now let's go into the business glossary and see if we see them. There you go. So we have our business glossary terms. The top level nodes are in here. We can go into them and see the terms within that. We see that ownership has been ingested as well. And we can go into each one of these things like, remember email? It's got a source. You can go view the source. It's also got related terms. And you can see that it inherits the classification confidential term. And so you can view it here as well. Similarly, we can go into accounts and go to the account term. And when we go to related terms, we see that it contains a balance, just like we had described, as well as inherits the highly confidential term. So that in a nutshell is how you can produce and load an entire business glossary into DataHub. So what good is a business glossary if you don't attach it to data sets and fields? So let's look at a particular data set that we might want to attach a business glossary to. Here is a user account, and it seems to have some tags like operational. It seems to have a field called an email, but we don't see any terms attached to them. And it would be nice to know that the user account is actually of type account, and the email in here is actually of type email. So let's ingest those terms. For that, I'll go back to the terminal. And in this case, I have a nicely prepared datasets.json file. If you're familiar with how MCEs look, you should be right at home here. This is one of the classic MCE JSON files. And what I have done here is just added at the top level, at the dataset level, a glossary term attachment, attaching this dataset to the clients and accounts.account term. And then further below in the field section, next to the email field, I have attached it to a glossary term called personal information.email. So now I have all of my terms attached to the appropriate place, one at the dataset level and one at the field level. And now let's try ingesting this. DataHub ingest -c datasets.yaml. All right, we ingested that record. And now if we refresh this page, woohoo, the demo works. We see tags and terms attached. An account has been attached to the account user account, and then the email term has been attached to the user. If I go into the email now, I'll see that there are related entities like data sets that are already attached to this thing, as well as if I go to the account term, I'll see that the same data set is also attached to these terms. It also, you can also search for these things. So I can just type email and I'll get a helpful drop down where autocomplete shows me that I can search for personal information.email. And if I search for it, I not only get the glossary term, but I also get the data sets that have that term attached to it. So that in a nutshell is the business glossary demo. Now let's go back to the next phase of product improvements, which are key value schemas in Kafka and better handling of nested schemas. So Kafka, as you know, has value schemas, but in many cases, people also use complex key schemas when they produce topics to Kafka. And in those cases, DataHub wasn't able to represent it before. So not anymore. We now support both keys as well as values. And so if you use the new Kafka source and upgrade your Acryl DataHub libraries, you'll be able to see both keys as well as values showing up in a toggle bar at the very top right. In addition to that, we also went in and improved our representation of highly structured nested schemas. So now you can finally ingest DataHub's own Kafka topics and actually explore the metadata schema itself. We've done a lot of work in representing structs as well as unions well. So you should be able to actually browse the schema pretty nicely and understand what this very complicated schema looks like.